Hello and welcome to this panel. My name is Giuliano Fiori and I'm Head of Studies on Humanitarian Affairs at Save the Children UK. I'm also one of the editors of Amidst the Debris, Humanitarianism and the End of Liberal Order, a book which from mid-June-ish you'll be able to pick up at all reputable bookstores and hopefully some disreputable ones as well. You'll also be able to access it or buy it on the usual e-commerce sites, from which you'll inevitably be packaged and delivered to you by people on precarious zero-hour contracts, who might also be supplementing other work because it doesn't pay enough, because society has accepted the claims that we can no longer protect workers' rights and challenge reducing real wages. Anyway, the book, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about that and its contents. And this is a lightning session. I must admit, my ability to handle the technology has not proven particularly lightning so far. And the book is almost 500 pages. So in 45 minutes, we're very unlikely, even at lightning speed, to get through all of its content. But we'll endeavor to do our best. I'm not yet accessing the platform, so I'm not able to see questions and comments as they come up. But the idea is this is going to be a somewhat informal conversation that will last the first half or a bit more of the 45 minutes. And then we'll open to comments and questions, provided that I can get onto the platform and access those. I'm very grateful to be joined by two of the contributing authors to the book. Stephanie Reist, who is, like me, based here in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And Stephanie is an essayist and a postdoctoral fellow at the Rural Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. We're also joined by Eleanor Davey, who is a historian and writer with particular interest in aid and activism, and also the role of history in contemporary practice. She's an honorary research fellow at the Australian Catholic University. And we're also joined by one of the other editors, Bertrand Tate, who is Professor of Cultural History at the University of Manchester and also the Director of the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. And he's based near Manchester in the UK, and Eleanor's based in or near Melbourne in Australia. So I mean, it's obviously a marvel of human ingenuity that we can speak to each other at such distance in these conditions. And at the same time, I can't help but feel every time I've done one of these online events in recent months that I'm enthusiastically taking up the invitation that we all receive with increasing frequency to abstract ourselves and each other, to abstract history and social relations from materiality, from material conditions and material processes. And I suppose one way to respond to that, or at least in this context, the first way to respond to that is to recognize that although this conversation is taking place lost somewhere in cyberspace, it's also being hosted by a place with a name and a history. And so we acknowledge the traditional owners of country across Australia. We acknowledge that this event hosted in Melbourne is taking place on lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. We recognize and we pay our respects to the elders past and present. And as we recognize their struggle for equality and against dispossession, we also recognize their kinship with others who have been dispossessed elsewhere through colonization and through expropriation. So this book, in some sense, maybe indirectly, responds to a massive expropriation. More specifically, it responds to a moment of emergence of what we've termed a visceral and affective politics that in some sense, or was partly itself a consequence of capitalist crisis at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. A crisis which accelerated relative impoverishment and the precarity of labor, while particular segments of capital exponentially enrich themselves. We were interested in how this moment raised certain anxieties about the end of something. It seemed that this visceral and affective politics, which was expressed or was manifesting itself often through sort of popular insurgencies, was directly and vocally challenging liberal norms and institutions. But it certainly seemed to be also challenging something of a consensus that had been held, at least superficially, for a couple of decades, a progressive neoliberal consensus, to give it a name. And we were interested in the responses to this situation. In particular, there was a rapidly growing body of writing, quite angsty writing, about liberal decline, but we were also interested in the response of aid workers and aid agencies to what they often have felt has been an attack over the last decade on hard-won gains, institutions and norms that they thought, or that we thought perhaps, had been solidified sufficiently. And so this book, rather than reproducing ideas about liberal decline, it tries to interrogate the idea that we are at the end of liberal order. So the subtitle, Humanitarianism and the End of Liberal Order, should be taken as provocation and not affirmation. But it does that through exploring one of perhaps the defining features of liberal order over the last couple of decades, and that is humanitarianism. And it really addresses three main questions. The first is, what is the relationship between contemporary humanitarianism and liberalism, more specifically liberal order? And in this conversation, we're not going to get into a technical discussion about what is liberal order or liberal ordering. I'll leave that for you to read about in the book. The second is this really the end of something? What is it the end of? Is it the end of liberal order itself? Is it the end of liberalism, as many people have said, or liberalism as we know it? Is it the end of a particular imagination? And the third, if there are really challenges emerging to what was before, some form of order, liberal order, what does that mean for contemporary humanitarianism? What does it mean for humanitarian practice? What does it mean for humanitarian agencies? And what does it mean for those who are on the receiving end of humanitarian aid? We should state at the beginning that the book is suggestive of a broader conception of humanitarianism than, let's say, the narrow or bounded idea of humanitarianism as a field of operational practice across borders in response to conflict and disaster. The book tends to present humanitarianism from different angles as a universal politics of human life. So to the extent that it deals with the relationship between politics and humanitarianism, it's often as interested in the humanitarianization of politics as it is the politicization of humanitarianism. And so getting into conversation with my colleagues here already, Stephanie's chapter discusses humanitarianization in a particular way, the way in which over recent times humanitarian geographies have been confused by political events, by changing circumstances. What was imagined as a humanitarian space or a humanitarian place, as Stephanie will explain, has perhaps changed over recent times, as has what was imagined as liberal place has also changed. So I'll pass over to Stephanie, and perhaps you can give a little overview of what your chapter is about and get into the conversation about the humanitarian imaginary.
Hi, good morning or good evening, everyone. It's morning here in Brazil. So the starting point for my chapter was kind of Trumpism in the US and the particular anxieties around the end of liberalism that Trump was said to embody. Particularly around the questions of America's decline, how he mobilized a sense of decline in opposition to globalization in particular. So when we're thinking about the humanitarian imaginary, one of the things that Trump mobilized in a lot of his discourses was putting the United States as a loser. He often talked about American carnage, that the global system was deteriorating American factories. America was losing to China, even particularly also losing to Mexico, or losing to its neighbors and losing to immigrants who were flooding and overwhelming the country. But stepping back a bit, many of the commentators who were bemoaning Trump's kind of rise to power saw him as confronting the rule-based system that had been established, I'm going to say, since the end of the Second World War, so kind of the US-led liberal order. So in my theorization for this chapter, I've kind of talked about liberal space or liberal place and humanitarian place, with these being very geographically demarcated. Liberal place essentially being the Western democracies, with humanitarian space invariably being Africa, Asia, parts of Latin America, and what that kind of meant racially and geopolitically. So part of my argument was Trump's awful comment of calling, various countries, including Haiti and several West African countries, shitholes. So what does that mean? When we've also already been in a kind of global context of ordering, where the liberal democracies are the ones. If the question for this conference is who are the humanitarians, there's been a long history in which the humanitarian subject or the humanitarian actor is coming from the West to aid, develop. We can also talk about white saviorism, the supposedly backwards or underdeveloped humanitarian place of the rest of the world. But that type of space becomes a little bit inverted when we kind of begin talking about the financial crisis of 2008 and kind of Trump's own rhetoric when it comes to the United States. And we can even see this in kind of grievance politics throughout the Western world. So Brexit also kind of mobilized against the immigrant. But there's this sense that even though these liberal place has been expanding globalization and kind of the rule-based system, mostly around kind of free market and capitalism, the backlash within countries like the United States and the UK has kind of focused on how that system is countering and going against the best interests of kind of what I would say is has been put as the white working class in both contexts. So this is not the traditional figure that we think of as needing humanitarian aid. In fact, often this figure is thought of as not needing aid because of their stick-to-itiveness and hardworking abilities in opposition to kind of citizens of other countries. So, but the backlash has been mobilized by various right-wing movements and very much concentrated on, the other, the immigrant other, the racialized other within the United States. And we kind of get that, what I and Giuliano also talk about is a lowering of humanitarian expectations or horizons. We can even see that before. A lot of my chapter talks about Hurricane Katrina, which I think is a kind of foreshadows much of how the neoliberal kind of order responds to humanitarian crises in general. But with that, because capitalism can no longer sustain kind of the expectations of, oh, my children's life are going to be better for the white middle class, that also means a lowering of expectations for humanitarian projects. So we can't properly address Hurricane Katrina because that would mean an undue handout, if it were, to to people who are ostensibly victims of crises. So I think part of how I'm thinking about humanitarianism or humanitarian intervention, kind of more broadly speaking, is what does it mean for something to happen to people? Because it seems, if we're thinking of the field of humanitarian action, crises seem kind of obvious. You kind of know it when it sees it. But when we talk about kind of 2008 and that type of global crises, there's the elite and global capital in general is often able to the displace any sort of nothing happened, right? That's just the system. And that ultimately serves to continue to lower these humanitarian expectations. So that's kind of the general kind of framework that I wanted to put forward. And then I believe we're passing it to kind of Eleanor to talk about more how that happens in context.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, so my chapter is very empirical, looking at a case from recent history. So as many people I'm sure will know, Australia has a policy of offshore detention for people who claim asylum after arriving via boat. And this is the sort of context in which I'm looking at humanitarian studies. So the current iteration of that system was put in place in 2012. And before that, there was a kind of first phase, 2001 to 2008. And as others have pointed out, scholars who work on this sort of framework as a whole, there are really important continuities there between anti-asylum policies and the techniques of colonial violence used against First Nations people after the settlement of Australia. And then in a kind of ongoing fashion since that time, in the racialized exclusion of those groups of people from the supposed protection benefits of Australian society, and in some of the techniques and geographies of that exclusion. So the camp, the island, as has been used for offshore detention, and scholars have worked on that extensively. What I'm looking at is how in this particular moment, in the second phase of offshore detention, between 2012 and 2015, there was a kind of NGO moment of offshore detention. So the Salvation Army and Save the Children Australia took contracts in that period to provide welfare, recreation services, education, and casework and case management services on Papua New Guinea and Nauru. The two organisations started at the same time. They had quite different trajectories. So the Salvation Army stopped their role in the early 2014, February 2014, whereas Save the Children had a first phase on Manus Island from 2012 into 2013. Children came off Manus Island, and then there was a second phase where families were put onto Nauru, and Save the Children entered a second phase, sort of reinitiated that contract and worked on there until 2015 when they exited in quite a controversial fashion, in clash with the government. So what I focus on is really the position of Save the Children, because their programs are more enduring. They were very large. There are hundreds of staff members on fly-in, fly-out contracts in that period. Only a small group amongst them had humanitarian experience, more likely to be teachers and social workers who'd worked in an Australian domestic setting, and they found themselves in these very austere and intentionally austere environments created as part of the deterrence policy. So what I do in the chapter, sort of mapping out some of this period, but then trying to really explore a bit more is the ethical implications of working in this environment. And what I think you see is this sort of organisation and individual burden on Save the Children and the Salvation Army and their staff members. These environments are very secretive. Sharing information of any kind is heavily penalised, criminalised, in fact. They're very remote. And the people who are detained in these islands essentially randomly are subjected to extraordinary levels of indignity and abuse. And so this burden that lies both on the organisation and on the individuals that work for the organisation, how it interacts, is some of what I tried to untangle by looking at people who spoke out, whistleblowers and so on, as well as the organisational positions. And just to get a really complex topic down to something very brief, I'm not sure that it's possible for organizations in this setting to actually lift that burden from their staff. I don't think there's any way they could have taken the ethical considerations out of their staff's minds and experiences. At the same time, I don't think that the ways that they operated really helped with that. So there were particular moments or practices that really exacerbated that burden on staff members rather than reduced that. And so you see that one of the effects of having those organizations work there was that they were channels for whistleblowers over time. Just to finish off, I just like to say as I mentioned, this moment has ended. It was in something of an experiment, I think, in offshore detention, which endures today. But I think it's really important, in part because for all the sort of context that Giuliano and Stephanie have laid out for us, this phenomenon of aid agencies operating in these spaces of hardened borders, I think, is really going to be one of the dilemmas that they grapple with, in a very ongoing way in this century. And so really thinking about what is it for a wealthy country to create conditions like that, and then for organizations which are often in quite strong relationships with those governments to then go into those spaces and seek to mitigate the human impacts of that. That's a really difficult dilemma that I think we'll be facing more and more. So that's the summary of my chapter, and now I'll hand over to Bertrand.
Well, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much to the organizers of this conference, to which my institute is associated, and I had a small part in the organization. So I'd like to congratulate them on a great program. Now, my paper is not at odds in a funny kind of way with the other two papers, but it's rather of a different nature. And pandemics do strange things to academics, and especially when they fall ill themselves and their topic changes nature before their very eyes. And I think that what happened in the last year has changed dramatically what I was writing, which was meant to be an archaeology of the history of humanitarian goods held in common, distributed in the name of the collective, and which embodied, in some ways, liberal values. And by liberal values, I refer here not only to liberties and property rights, but also the existence of those liberties and property rights in an open market. So my interest is in the fact that humanitarians are actually in the business of dealing with things. These objects are obviously running along the lines of the invisible side of humanitarian work for most of the time. But in the last year, during this crisis, a number of major trade disputes, borders, protectionism claims around protectionism around PPE equipment, around vaccines, as we see today, disputes between states and capitalist forces, disputes between humanitarian organizations and the producers of those vaccines and products, have all brought to light the fact that actually the logistics of humanitarianism are indeed at the heart of its politics too, and that some of the liberal values that were embodied in these objects are actually heavily contested today. So that's my preliminary point. Now, as a historian, my research interests are fairly eclectic. I think that's a reasonable point to make. But one thing that I've always been interested in is the moment when humanitarian aid emerged as a concept rather than a practice. So in other words, the early days when the Red Cross was nothing more than an inverted Swiss flag, and when the principles of the Geneva Convention were deeply buried into a very short document that only a very few signatory states had endorsed. Now, 3 years after the founding of the Red Cross movement, there is the first fair trade, if you want, the first trade of goods around humanitarianism. So when the humanitarians organize an exhibition of themselves, they obviously put the Geneva Convention in a nice glass box, but this showed a variety of goods. And those goods were meant to be inventions or innovations that humanitarians intended to turn into, through a process of norm setting, into the basis of their practices. So it's very important to think about the fact that humanitarian organizations and volunteers and enthusiasts from the onset were putting a lot of their attention to the development of objects, the development of types and norms, and this norm setting dimension of humanitarian aid, which people tend now to attribute to, say, the Sphere project or to the very recent attempts at normalizing the quality of products by WHO, if you want the validation of certain types of treatments. That norm setting process is intrinsic to humanitarian aid from day one. That and the fact that capitalists and enterprises joined in and contributed substantially to this norm-setting effort, and including by investing massively in innovations and the production of goods. So my point here was, of course, that if we look at the supply chains of humanitarian action, and my interest is mostly medical, I must confess, you will find that there is a rather complex entanglement between humanitarian aid and the rule of the market. Now, humanitarians today are facing a range of challenges and contradictions. And one of the challenges and contradictions that COVID-19 brought to light with all these issues is that the global market is not as global as one imagines it to be, that B, liberal forces are countered by national forces, that there is therefore a re-erection of barriers as trade barriers, and that these trade barriers are applied most significantly against the free trade or the liberal distribution of goods according to needs that humanitarians claim to be wanting. Now, I say claims to be wanting because I think there is a very ambiguous relationship. I'm going to be quite provocative here, but in a sense, promoting a very free trade approach to the distribution of vaccines, for example, an open market approach to distribution of vaccines, making sure that everywhere in the world can have access to those products, that they're not channeled by states or controlled by states, puts in some respects the humanitarians in the same position as other copyright infringers trying to promote, if you want, cheaper forms of production of goods and distribution of goods, the sort of agents of globalization. At the other end of the spectrum, we find that states promoting monopolies and national industries are actually practicing very anti-liberal forms of capitalism that throw us back to perhaps isolationist periods of the interwar. So we are in a funny kind of moment when a lot of the conversations around the economics of aid are actually up in the air, including the fact that this entanglement between humanitarians and states, which has been embodied by massive investment from states, so for example, DFID funding in the United Kingdom, is now crumbling under pressure from, if you want, national populist movements like the government of Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom. So we have a tension around the economics of aid, and that tension is revealed, in my view, by looking at what I call the liberal values of objects, so the liberal values of the supply chains of humanitarian aid. And this is quite a complicated story. So my chapter attempts to do some of the unpacking, showing notably that for a very long part of this history, Western capitalists, humanitarians, and then colonial powers were quite fond of promoting, if you want, the humanitarian values of capitalism. And that split between humanitarians and industrialists has taken place sometime in the 1960s and 70s, but with some ambiguities, because some capitalists are good still in the eyes of humanitarians, and sometimes they need to, I think they ought to think about why it is that they attribute to, say, Big Pharma in the Indian subcontinent virtues that it denies to Big Pharma in the global north. I'm not making a judgment as to the virtues of Big Pharma. I'm just highlighting that there is an interesting contradiction or inconsistency in the way we approach the owning and the valuing of intellectual goods depending on where they're produced. And that tension reveals the fact that humanitarians are not completely reconciled as to their position in a capitalist globalized economic world. That's my chapter in a nutshell.
Thank you, Bertrand. Thanks to the three of you for those presentations of your chapters. Different chapters with some points of convergence, and the collection is very varied. Not to say eclectic. I think there's a wide range of chapters, different sorts of content, different sorts of writing as well, which I think is actually one of hopefully one of the appeals. I'll just say a few words about my chapter to the extent that it relates to some points that have already been raised. What I was trying to do with my chapter, at least what I was trying to do once I got into writing it, and I think I went through something similar with similar to Bertrand, the fact that the pandemic changed my chapter and my thinking about my chapter, is what is the present conjuncture, not just what is it doing to humanitarianism, but what has humanitarianism contributed to the present conjuncture? How has humanitarian imagination contributed to historical process? What is the role of imagination in historical process? But also, what can we see today that is a legacy, a direct legacy, an obvious legacy of what's been going on over the last 20 to 30 years, maybe a bit more, and what feels more like rupture or discontinuity. And I think something of what Bertrand was talking about there is at the end was relevant in that there seems to be a reaffirmation of the freedom of movement for goods in this context. And I live in Brazil when it seems that where it's clear that a free market for vaccines is favored by big pharma and also by private health firms here. But at the same time, barriers being raised to prevent certain forms of cultural and intellectual intercourse, and also to prevent movement of people. So what does it mean to live in a world where there's freedom of movement for goods and capital, but not for people? I think that's one of the big questions that we perhaps need to ask as people who are interested in politics of human life over the coming times. But I tried to approach that question really thinking about history with a big H, and there's been a lot of talk about the end of history in recent times. Of course, Francis Fukuyama most famously, among others, talked about the end of history around the time of the end of the Cold War. But this was perhaps only the high point of an endism, we could call it, that had already been quite present in pop culture as well as intellectual culture and theory from the 1950s onwards. And what I tried to do is take a sort of materialist perspective on that. Think about what are the material processes at a global scale that contribute to a closure of the historical imagination, a closure of a sense of history, the idea that history can no longer progress, that we've reached a stage which is either the high point of historical development or some form of stagnation. And what does humanitarianism have to do with that? And it's inevitably a fragmented chapter because it was too big a topic to tackle in one go. But my argument, broadly speaking, is that humanitarianism or an idea of a humanitarian minimum becomes a social ideal, which is ultimately the height of expectations. It's no longer something that's deemed necessary to provide in simply in cases of emergency, but it's something that should be the height of expectations for all societies. In this sense, the emergence of the periphery is not so much seen as a catching up of those who had fallen behind or weren't yet modern. It's sort of the arrival of the periphery to a dystopian future, and one in which the core, or the center, capitalist center, particularly the West, develops traits or characteristics of the periphery. And so there's a reduction of social expectations for all to something like the minimum of survival.